Thank you all for coming and welcome to the second Wingara Aboriginal Health Seminar. Before we commence, I'd like to invite Uncle Chika Madden to give a welcome to country. Thanks, Uncle Chika.
Good, thank you. Yes, good afternoon, folks. My name is Charles Madden, but known around the inner city of Sydney as Chika. Now that's a nickname that I got many, many years ago going to Redfern Public School, which is now NCIE, the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence. Folks, I'm from Gadigal land, Aboriginal land, that's just across the bay. Today, I acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gamaragal people. But the Gamaragal and Gadigal are two of 29 clans that make up the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bordered by three distinctive landmarks. We have the Hawkesbury River to the north, Nepean to the west, and the Georges River to the south. Those three rivers form the boundaries of the Eora Nation. Folks, for many, many years I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I've been involved with many different Aboriginal organisations over the years. I've been a director with the Aboriginal Medical Service at Redfern for over 40 years. Also a director with the Redfern Aboriginal Housing Company, Aboriginal Hostels Australia, and the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, where I am still a very active member. I've got to mention it, folks, also a life member of the Redfern All Blacks Rugby League Football Club. Folks, for many, many years I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I'd like to take this opportunity this afternoon to extend a warm and sincere welcome to all of my Aboriginal brothers and sisters, non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters. If we have any brothers and sisters here from the Torres Strait or further far across the seas, welcome. Welcome to the land of Eora. Folks, for many, many years I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I've travelled, met a lot of people, but it's always a pleasure to come back to Eora. Folks, if you've travelled across this great city of ours today, the state or this great country, or from afar, welcome. Welcome to the land of Gamaragal. Enjoy your stay, have a safe and trouble-free trip home. Once again, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you. Enjoy the day, folks. Thank you.
No, thanks for that welcome to country, Uncle Chika. I really appreciate you and your time coming over here today on this side of the bridge, eh? I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Gamaragal people of the Eora Nation. Oh, true God, sorry, I pressed your buttons. And I'd like to acknowledge my traditional custodians of the land and any Aboriginal people who are here today. So good afternoon, thanks for coming. The Wingara Seminar Series aims to bring highly specialised and talented Aboriginal people in for lunchtime sessions to share their skills with us. The aim is for you to go back and reflect on your own work practices around Aboriginal health, see what you may be able to do to increase your skills and implement some of the tried and tested ways of working that are going to be mentioned. The goal from the sessions we are reaching for is real and measurable improvement in Aboriginal health in New South Wales. So here on Gamaragal Country today, I have the privilege of introducing today's keynote speaker, Jason Ardler. He's the head of Aboriginal Affairs, leading whole of government and intergovernmental Aboriginal Affairs strategy and program development. Jason also has the responsibility for leading the implementation of the New South Wales Government Communities Plan for OCA. I hope I said that right. Please check it out if you haven't already, and go and have a look at all their other things on their website too. It's really, really deadly actually. So Jason will speak about the approaches taken, challenges faced, and outcomes achieved by Aboriginal Affairs in building momentum to change the way business is done in Aboriginal communities. especially appropriate ways to co-design projects. So please, everyone, welcome Mr. Jason Ardler.
Thanks, Megan. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Oh my God, look how many there are of you. I wasn't expecting that. It's a bit daunting. Thank you for that introduction. As Megan said, my name is Jason Ardler. I'm a Yuin man from the south coast of New South Wales. So Yuin country stretches from the Shoalhaven River at Bomaderry Nowra in the north down to the Victorian border and across to this side of, or the eastern side of the Monaro. That's Yuin country. And I hail from a beautiful little place called Ardler, where most of my family still live. And so I want to start, of course, by acknowledging that we are on Camera Eagle land and thanking Uncle Chika for that welcome to country. And I was kind of chuckling to myself as Megan started her introduction of me. I always cringe when people start reading out that bio, and I always think back to a conversation that I had with my father, who's 83, 84 this year. And I was going through a bit of a phase where I was thinking about career moves and what I wanted to do with the next little bit of the journey. And I was talking to Dad about the possibility of moving back to Ardler and thinking, well, if I did that, what on earth would I do? And he said, yeah, son, tell me a little bit about what you do. And kind of tried to explain what you do in these roles, you know, lots of emails, lots of meetings, lots of this, lots of that, briefing notes, etc. And he said, son, you'll be right, there's plenty of admin work down here. And I said, thank you, Dad. Nothing like family to kind of keep you grounded, keep you rooted, remind you where you come from. Yeah, awesome. So as Megan said, I've been asked to come and talk to you a little bit about the work that Aboriginal Affairs has been doing, particularly our work in delivering ochre with Aboriginal communities and the way we've been engaging with communities around that work. But I want to start by, of course, saying congratulations actually for this this series. I think this is awesome. I understand this is only your second one, but really a big shout out to Elizabeth Coffin, to Jerry and others who have made this happen, and I hope Elizabeth's giving it a plug to her colleagues at the Secretary's Board, because I think it's a great initiative. So in thinking about where to start today, I thought what I would do is give you a little bit of context of some of the most recent work we've been doing around our research agenda, because that was the thing that caused me to have to reflect back not only on the last few years working with ochre, but in fact why I got into Aboriginal Affairs policy in the first place. And so I guess if we start thinking about 2011, 2012, the Ministerial Task Force on Aboriginal Affairs was running around the state doing what was at the time, and probably still is, unprecedented community engagement. And it was engagement that ultimately led to the establishment of our Aboriginal Affairs Plan ochre. And what we heard everywhere we went from Aboriginal people was this very clear message that while we'd had various plans and various policies in the past, all of them had raised great expectations for Aboriginal communities, but none of them had actually delivered the tangible improvements in the lives of Aboriginal communities that they had promised. And we got this quite unambiguous, quite direct message really, that while we were, you know, the communities were prepared, communities were prepared, I've got to keep my hands behind my back, don't I? Communities were prepared to have these conversations. They, you know, but we were very much on notice. We've had these conversations before, you know, governments, you know, earlier iterations of you have been out, you've asked us these questions before, we've given you the same answers and we will continue to give you the same answers. But you are on notice this time round. Our expectation is that you not only listen to what we have to say, but you hear what we have to say, and that you respond in a positive way to what you're being told. And during those conversations, communities everywhere raised up 4 kind of key reform areas that they saw were important to their future well-being. And they went to economic prosperity. People said we want real jobs and real business opportunities in the real economy. Closely aligned to that, people said we want to be able to realise the social, economic and cultural opportunity that's in land for us. Language and culture came up everywhere as the key, the keys really to unlocking well-being and healing for Aboriginal individuals and Aboriginal communities. And self-determination or agency, you know, so this capacity and opportunity to make their own decisions about their own lives were the issues that came up everywhere we went. So people weren't raising services, they certainly weren't talking about gaps. They were saying our aspirations lie in cultural strength, economic prosperity, and our own agency to be able to be in control of our own lives. A couple of weeks ago, the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs launched the Aboriginal Affairs Strategic Research Agenda, and so we developed that over a period of time with a view to building evidence and new knowledge that we thought was missing in trying to drive and support this reform agenda. And in the process of doing that, it became apparent that there were some sort of wraparound practices that would be quite significantly influential in whether we were able to achieve the development of these policies or the implementation of new policies that would drive or deliver these aspirations. They're things that we talk about a lot, but we have very little literature or very little evidence to support our deeper understanding of what works and why. And they go to things, and none of these will be a surprise, I wouldn't think, the cultural capability of the public sector and others who are delivering services to Aboriginal communities. Again, related to this, because we as public servants generally don't exist outside of or in isolation of broader society, and that is the nature of the public discourse around Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities, the negativity that we see and hear in the media all the time. Our evaluation and research practice, and what are we measuring? Are we measuring things that are important to us, measuring things that are important to Treasury officials, or are we measuring things that are meaningful to Aboriginal people? And the fourth one, which is the one I'm going to focus on this afternoon, which is bringing the voice of Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities into the development of policy. So we've developed this research agenda that really makes this deliberate shift away from gaps and deficits to emphasise aspirations, to emphasise outcomes, and most importantly, to put the relationship or the transformation of the relationship between government and Aboriginal people at its heart. Structurally, this agenda, what we've done is we've got these 8 reform areas, and we've had a leading academic or a leading practitioner prepare or write a paper on each one of those. And what those papers do are kind of unpack where we think we are, what we know currently, and what we think are the gaps in our knowledge that we need to fill to be able to drive the reform agenda. So there are 7 leading academics or practitioners and me. So I'm number 8, so I did a paper as well. And what I'm going to do is largely talk to you about my paper, which is in fact a reflection piece for me. So what I did in thinking about this was thought about how did I get into this space? And I realised when I was writing it, and it was kind of middle of last year or late last year, that it actually almost to the day was 20 years since I'd gotten into the broader Aboriginal Affairs policy space. So not within the agency, but working in the policy area of Aboriginal Affairs. And I could remember very shortly after I started, I had a boss who was an Aboriginal woman, and probably at the time one of the most senior Aboriginal people in the sector, probably one of the only Aboriginal people in the sector at that kind of SES equivalent, or what we would call now, I guess, at least band 1. And she said to me, you know, Jason, I've been in this space 20 years and nothing's changed. And my first thought at the time was, bloody hell, imagine doing anything for 20 years. I was young. But I think when I reflect back on it now, I think she was saying 2 things to me in her own way. One was, keep your expectations low. And I think the other one was that somehow it's somebody else's responsibility to make change happen, which seemed a little odd, well, certainly does now. And then I think, so from there, so that's 20 years ago, a few years later, restructures and all the rest of it, I find myself in her role. So I'm now the boss. And I'm sitting at a table with other senior public servants. I don't think it would be any of you because you all look far too young to have been there at the time. And we're talking about the previous government's Aboriginal Affairs plan. Some of you will remember 2 Ways Together. And I was really struck, I remember at the time, by this really stark contrast in the language that I and my colleagues were using to talk about our relationship with Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities. And their discourse was really dominated by this language of victim and perpetrator and client. And I remember thinking at the time, this really doesn't sit comfortably with me. It certainly doesn't make sense to me in terms of the way I think about my own family or my own community. And I was coming from a land management agency, so I came out of the National Parks Service, what would now be OEH. And we were working with Aboriginal communities as rights holders, as stakeholders, as co-managers, And so coming into this space that was all about deficit, it just really struck me as, well, it horrified me, quite frankly. And it occurred to me at the time that that was probably the fundamental thing that was wrong with Aboriginal Affairs policy, that it was all driven by this notion of Aboriginal people as victims and perpetrators and clients, not as human beings with aspiration. And then I think about this kind of policy evolution from 1788 onwards, which is really where this preoccupation with observing and analysing and measuring Aboriginal people began. And if we track that policy evolution from protection and segregation through to assimilation and integration, and even to this kind of ironic notion of giving people self-determination, I don't know how you do that. But we see all through that time that government maintained control of the agenda through the measurement of gaps and deficits. And we see that continue today with this notion of closing the gap. So for me, it was really from that point that I started to commit myself to creating a policy space where conversations went beyond Aboriginal people as disadvantaged and dysfunctional. And we started different conversations that were driven by people's aspirations. And that's really how we get to where we are today. And so the first big opportunity I saw was 2011. Change of government, finishing up of 2 ways together, a new government that, as they all do, came in and said, we're going to be different, until they're not. And what we're going to do is we're going to develop a new Aboriginal Affairs plan, and we're going to do that with Aboriginal communities. And I thought, great. First real opportunity to fundamentally change the way we do business with Aboriginal people. And so what we saw out of extensive consultation was OCA. And OCA, for mine, is the first Aboriginal Affairs plan probably in the country to really put Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities at the centre of its design and implementation. The OCA itself, it's a fabulous acronym, and the word, OCA, very much captures that deep connection. It symbolises that deep connection between Aboriginal people and their country. But the words themselves, I think, it's important not to lose sight of. Opportunity, choice, healing, responsibility and empowerment. They were the key drivers for change that were identified by Aboriginal communities as we went around and talked to them. So it wasn't just that it's a nice, convenient acronym. These words actually were the words that people were using to describe the aspirations that they had for themselves and their communities. OCA's development and the way we're going about implementing it is that also it's kind of this ambitious process of co-design. And I mean that in more than just the buzzword that it's become. So in going about this, we've had to learn to share power. We've had to move from defending what we do, because that's what we do, to accepting that sometimes what we do doesn't always work. We've had to move from consulting with people to negotiating with people. We've had to embrace things that are unfamiliar. We've gone about this iteratively because we didn't have all the answers, so we had to take our time and work through things. Importantly, we've had to focus not on fixing problems, but on supporting people to achieve their aspirations, and they're quite different things. We've had to really immerse ourselves in Aboriginal communities to understand their aspirations and to be confident that we could work in both Western and Aboriginal ways. We've had to stay the course, we've had to keep focused, particularly when things aren't easy, and they often aren't, and we've had to be very clear about accountability in the way we've gone about it. Who is ultimately accountable. And by working in this way, what we've seen is strong community buy-in to what we're doing and the way we're doing it. And a real belief, I think, and I've tested this with some of our community stakeholders, that we're serious in our rhetoric. 5 years into OCA, the participation in the initiatives that sit within the plan continue to grow every year. So every year we're seeing more kids learning languages in schools through the language nests. Every year we're seeing more kids taking up opportunities through the opportunity hubs to transition from school to work. Every year we're seeing more communities interested in participating in local decision making, and I'll talk about some of that a bit more. And so what we're seeing is a demand for further rollout of these initiatives greater than what we can support, that our budget will allow, that our numbers on the ground will support. And I think certainly unlike previous plans, when I think back to the way communities talked about plans like 2 ways together that quite quickly became 2 ways apart, and any 2 ways as long as it's government's way, and all those kind of, derisive ways of describing it. We don't hear that with ochre. There is still, by and large, a very positive perception and resonance, I think, in the community to ochre. So we have spent time trying to understand this notion of co-design and what does it mean. And what ochre has taught us is that it's not rocket science. It's far from rocket science, actually, but it's also not just some variation of business as usual. It is a different way of working, not just another buzzword to describe same old, same old. From our perspective and our experience, it's full of possibilities. It's certainly been complex in its implementation, and there have been challenges along the way. It's raised questions for us about power and who holds the power and who exercises power. It's raised questions about aspiration, whose aspiration and for what. It's raised questions about the priority that governments give Aboriginal affairs policy. It's certainly raised questions about the cultural capability of public servants to deliver on people's aspirations, including our ability to work within Aboriginal perspectives. And so to address these, we have had to be innovative, we have had to be flexible, we have had to be committed, we have had to continually check ourselves. How are we going? How are we tracking? And we have had to acknowledge that many of the things that Aboriginal people are interested in talking to us about fall outside of our traditional kind of service delivery relationships. They don't work in that paradigm. What we've found, what we've seen, is that ochre and the work of the ministerial task force that led to it I think will be looked upon, and we are already looking upon it as a significant milestone in Aboriginal affairs in New South Wales. They've changed the way policy is developed, certainly by my organisation. They've changed the nature of the relationship we have with Aboriginal communities. They've changed the expectations that Aboriginal communities have on us, and they've raised. And they've even changed the role of the Office of Aboriginal Affairs within government and within the community. Having said all that, there is still a degree to which co-design is just being used as another buzzword in government. I've sat in conversations with the federal government talking about the Close the Gap refresh, and they're talking about taking a co-design approach, and so, well, what does that mean? Well, we're going to consult for a couple of months. Wrong. That's not co-design. And so what we are seeing, of course, is communities continue to be cynical about this. The governments and consultants are talking about co-design and really just doing same old, same old. From our perspective, God, I've got to stop doing that. Organisations like the McKell Institute and others are now starting to look at ochre as good practice nationally. Not best practice, never be that arrogant, but better practice. It's something that we're really proud of, I have to say. The thing is, the promise of ochre was that it would change or reset the relationship between Aboriginal communities and the New South Wales Government, not just between Aboriginal communities and my organisation. So that means the way we're working needs to be the way you and other agencies who are delivering services or developing policies for Aboriginal people, you have to do business in the way that we're doing business. And that means that genuine co-design has to become your business as usual. So that's a challenge for us. We've spent 5 years kind of honing this internally, and now we're thinking about, well, how do we start influencing the way others do business? And the way we've decided to go about that is by starting a movement. So in Aboriginal affairs right now, we like to think that we're quietly going about creating a movement. We have been the lone nut. I'm a bit of a lone nut from time to time. I'm not going to dance. I refuse to dance. We've had the second guy, we've had a few more, we've certainly got plenty of fence sitters and plenty of naysayers. But we've gone about this pretty quietly. I think it's fair to say most people haven't got a clue what we're up to. And so what I wanted to do is fill you in a little bit on what we're about, what our movement's about. First thing to say about our movement is that membership is open. You're all invited, while it's still possible to be part of the in crowd. We don't discriminate. You can be shirted, you can be shirtless. We don't mind. You can be Aboriginal, you can be non-Aboriginal. You can be from government, you can be from academia, you can be from the general public. We will take all comers. The only qualification, the only requirement is a commitment to achieving a relationship between Aboriginal people and government that is based on principles of partnership and power sharing. mutual respect and understanding, investment in community strengths, transparency and local accountability. That's what we're aiming for, because that's what Aboriginal communities have told us that they want. Like any good movement, we have some principles for the way we work and how we conduct ourselves. These are a mix of traditional Aboriginal custom and some more recent practices that we've honed over the last 230 odd years. So we do draw from and celebrate the rich diversity and cultures of Aboriginal people. We do respect both traditional and contemporary customs and practice and protocols. We respect learning as an ongoing and shared process. So neither side has all the answers, and we don't wait till we've got all the answers before we start. We respect Aboriginal ways of knowing, of being and doing. We support Aboriginal people to charter their own course, really important. And we do things with Aboriginal people, not to Aboriginal people. The rest you can read for yourself. What I want to do now is give you kind of 3 case studies, really. I'll be short in them, that explain that or demonstrate that if we work in accordance with these principles, we can fundamentally change policy and relationships. Case study 1 is about healing. So Aboriginal people have always known that it is connection with culture, community and country that keep us physically, emotionally and spiritually healthy. These notions of dysfunction and disadvantage are actually quite recent. They come with government intervention, quite frankly. And these interventions have led to loss. Loss of land, loss of livelihood, loss of control, loss of sense of purpose, and a sense of not belonging in our own country. The natural outcome of this kind of loss is trauma. So when the government in 2011 went around talking to Aboriginal people about what should be in a new Aboriginal Affairs plan, communities right across the state warned us. They said, if you continue to focus on the gaps and deficits that characterise disadvantage, you will continue to spend billions of dollars delivering services and you will continue to see the same crappy outcomes that you see today. Instead, what they said was that we should shift our focus away from services and prioritise keeping people out of the service system in the first place. So there's a sense that we spend a lot of time thinking about the experience that people will have when they get into the system and not a lot of time thinking about how we get them out or keep them out in the first place. So to do that means addressing the root causes of disadvantage, and to do that means healing. But for many outside of our movement, the fence sitters, the naysayers, that was problematic. So people said, well, you're telling us healing is a journey that by necessity is different for every individual, every family, every community. So it doesn't lend itself to clear definition. We can't count it. We can't performance report it. These are all important things. You can't achieve it through a program necessarily. It's not a single event, a course. We don't hand you a certificate and say, voila, you're healed. Congratulations. So all of these raise dilemmas for us and raise dilemmas for the government. If you can't measure it, if you can't have a program to deliver it, how does the government respond? What's our role? And how do we include it in an Aboriginal Affairs plan that by and large was about programs and initiatives? But despite all of those challenges, because we had committed ourselves to this set of principles, and because the government had publicly committed to listening to Aboriginal people, healing not only became included in OCA without a predetermined program, but as the acronym suggests, it's actually at the very centre of OCA and dictates the way we do business, this healing-informed approach. So the inclusion of healing in an Aboriginal Affairs plan signalled both an acceptance and a commitment by government. An acceptance that past government actions and interventions had created trauma for communities, and a commitment to talking and listening to Aboriginal communities, to building partnerships, to creating understandings of how government could support the work of community to heal in culturally appropriate ways. Not to heal people, but to support the work that was going on in communities. So as a result of that, we've got healing forums happening across New South Wales, or have had over the last 12 months, and there are conversations that are going on that are deep and substantial, and better understandings, better relationships are being built as a consequence. For us, we've had to remain really vigilant because there's always the risk of falling back into old ways of working. We've had the temptation always to rush forward towards a solution, to develop a policy, to develop a program, to develop a framework, because that's the way we've always responded. So far not. Happy to report, by adhering to these principles, we are working with Aboriginal communities towards solving, over time, a seemingly intractable problem, and ironically a problem that we specifically weren't setting out to address. And that is about how do we close the gap. But it's not about closing the gap through more services. In fact, it's about closing the gap through healing and reducing service dependency in the long run. Second example is around agreement making and the way we have changed the way we do agreement making locally with Aboriginal communities. Again, when the Ministerial Task Force was conducting its consultations that delivered OCA, the clear, consistent message we heard was that Aboriginal communities wanted a different relationship. A relationship that wasn't based on fixing people up, but one that was based on lifting them up, supporting them to achieve their aspirations. In this kind of relationship, power does have to be shared, decisions have to be transparent, outcomes need to be measured against indicators that are important to Aboriginal communities, and accountability has to be clear. Obviously that kind of change, and it is a fundamental change to the way we do business, was never going to be easy. We asked ourselves, why would government share power and control? The measurement of Aboriginal disadvantage has become an industry, quite frankly, and the announcement of progress, or lack of, has become an annual event, and we get media releases and it's all good. The governments have invested heavily in how and where they provide services and how they determine the success of those services. So there are issues of power, there are issues of ownership, there are issues of control that we needed to sort through. To some extent we had luck around this in 2011, 2012 when we were proposing this way of working. We had a new government that was committed to local decision making and accountable government. We had irrefutable evidence that the business as usual approach wasn't working, wasn't changing anything. And we had a group of people in a movement who saw an opportunity in this and pursued it hard. And the result was local decision making, which has become a flagship initiative within OCA. This time, the naysayers weren't only in government. In fact, most of the naysaying came from Aboriginal communities who had heard the rhetoric of shared decision making and self-determination before and were sceptical. So we had to be seen to be doing things differently. So we invited, rather than nominated, communities to participate. We ran an open EOI process. We left it to those communities to determine what are their boundaries, what's their membership, what are their priorities, how will they operate, what are their rules. We built incentive into the model for communities to build their capacity with government support. It was tricky. You know, when we went out and talked to people about this stuff, they said, we don't believe you. What's our boundary? You're saying this is going to be regional. What's a region? It's up to you. Really? How do we need to constitute ourselves? It's up to you. Really? There was a lot of scepticism in communities that we were serious. But today, we've got agreement making under local decision making mandated through a Premier's memorandum that establishes the expectations on public servants for how they'll participate. We've got government and communities entering into formal negotiations to establish binding agreements that we call accords. Agencies are required to negotiate openly, in good faith, to share data and to work towards positive outcomes, not just what's the new service we're going to deliver. Government negotiators have to be senior. They have to be culturally competent. None of these things are business as usual, either for government or Aboriginal communities. We entered into this without all the answers. When I sit down with my colleagues from Prime Minister and Cabinet who are rolling out the Empowered Communities model, they spent $5 million on the Boston Consulting Group, asking them to develop up something that's not dissimilar to this. And they'd say, well, how did you overcome this issue? Well, we haven't yet. Surely you didn't start before you dealt with that. Well, actually, yeah, we did. We just got in, gave it a crack, and we're tweaking as we go. And what we're seeing, and it's relatively early days still, is that the relationships on the ground are changing. It's not just the same old service provider, service recipient relationship. We are seeing partnerships form. We are seeing shared purpose and shared goals being developed, and we're seeing increasing community buy-in into this. We started with a commitment to 3 trials in local decision making. We've now got 8 8 regions covering, probably 70% of the state participating in this, and other regions starting to build their governance arrangements, because communities are saying to us, and we said to some of these groups, we can't support you. We do not have the resources to take on any more, and they said, we don't care. We think this is going to work for us, and we're going to have a crack. Interesting question around self-determination. How does the government respond when the community says, we don't care, we're going to do it anyway, and we expect you to support us? And that's exactly what we've had to confront. And as I say, it's self-determination by every definition of the word, I think. The final story, because I can see people looking at the clock, is about the introduction of the new New South Wales Aboriginal Languages Act last year. The first and only legislation in Australia to recognise the significance of Aboriginal languages to the well-being of Aboriginal people and the broader cultural heritage of New South Wales. So again, everywhere the Ministerial Task Force went, the importance of language and culture came up. The desire for government to support community efforts to develop and grow language came up. So OCA responded by saying we will refresh the existing Aboriginal languages policy. And we started down that process, but what we found quite quickly was that policy was not going to be a sufficiently strong enough instrument. All of these languages were critically endangered. We needed a long-term commitment, we needed long-term focus, and we weren't going to get that from a policy. So we proposed legislation. And the naysayers responded. I remember the day it happened. There was a minister at the time said, that will never happen. We will never do that. We will never legislate in this state to protect Aboriginal languages. Would have been pretty easy to kind of leave it at that. But instead, we stayed determined and we re-prosecuted the argument time and time again. Changes of minister and all the rest of it. And eventually we got members of the movement who took it up, and we got to draft a bill. The first draft of the bill had community-controlled governance at its heart. So we knew when we went out to communities, they would say, community has to control this. The problem we had was that it was at odds with government policy around, they were trying to reduce the number of statutory boards and the statutory committees. And so we actually had cabinet decided that we had to change the draft and pull that out. When we went out and talked to community on the consultation draft, they saw legislation as being akin to government control. We've had this before, and we were using language that we thought was okay. We're going to protect Aboriginal languages. Well, we've had protection before. Protection put us onto reserves. Protection took away our languages in the first place. So people had issues with that kind of language, but most fundamentally they said, we will not support Aboriginal languages legislation, as important as it is, unless there is governance that is sufficiently independent of government. And that means we want something like a statutory trust. And so that put us into a really interesting situation. We had on one hand central agencies saying, well, the government's kind of decided this, so you need a plan B. And we had communities saying, we've decided this. It's this or nothing. There is no acceptable plan B. And so what we did ultimately was, true to our mandate, I think, is we went forward with the community voice. So we backed in that community voice and we said, this is the only thing that's acceptable. And so by taking that kind of positive, aspirational, Aboriginal people need to control the growth and development of their languages, the government ultimately changed its mind. And we have now got a commitment to the establishment of a independent statutory trust comprised of Aboriginal people who are seen as credible language experts in their own communities. So they're all really positive experiences that we've had just by kind of maintaining, let's move on, that set of principles. Notwithstanding that we have seen success and we know that we need to do things in a different way, we still have lots of naysayers, lots of fence sitters, and I don't want to go into the whole why thing. I think for me, it kind of comes down to two issues really. One is about the way we structure ourselves and our culture as a sector. The way we do things, the way budgets flow, I think how we're trained, our culture of the sector means that collaboration and pursuing solutions often are counterintuitive to us. We kind of operate in our lanes. And what we heard when we were talking to to public servants who were negotiating some of these accords was that they hear the rhetoric from Sydney about collaboration and innovation and all of that. They don't trust it. They don't trust because of the way our culture works, because of the way political lanes run. the way the budgets are allocated, that if we go out and do it that way, that we're actually not going to get support from the centre. So there's an interesting issue of trust in all of that for us. The other aspect I think that holds us back is the assumptions that we make about Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities and the capacity and the capability in those communities. Our experience is that Aboriginal communities have very good insights into what does and doesn't work for them. They know what needs to change and they want to work with us to find solutions that will work for them. But I think sometimes, our structures and our cultures and our training get in the way of that. How am I going for time? I feel like I've been talking for a very long time.
You've probably got about 3 minutes.
3 minutes, all right. Okay, well I was going to play a short snippet of one of our community stakeholders who talks about local decision making and what it means to work in that way, but I won't, given that. What I will say is that Brett Timid is the chair of one of the regional alliances that we're working in under local decision making, and Brett lives up at Grafton on the North Coast. So the kind of things that he talks about are the fact that we need a 7-day-a-week relationship, not a part-time relationship, and that relationship needs to be built on mutual respect, integrity, and honesty. He uses phrases like, we need to know that the ground that we're standing on is solid, that the rug's not going to be pulled out from under us just as we start to buy in. The government's going to go the distance. Again, there's a lot of concern about, we start things and we don't see the success the way we measure it, and therefore we pull it off, we withdraw it and we think, well, we'll try something else, and people are constantly having to start again, the 3-year pilot syndrome. And ultimately what he's saying is that it's about people and it's about families, and that's that quote, when we go home at night, we look at our families, and that's why we do the work that we do, and he's kind of inviting us as public servants to do the same thing. Ultimately, what Brett would have said if I'd given him his voice is that... Sorry, Brett. Is that there is great optimism in Aboriginal communities for the way that we are working. And so what I thought, given the time, is I will just leave you with my very short, sharp 8 tips for working like this. And this comes out of really 5 years of working in Oka. Number 1, don't proceed unless there is political acceptance that existing policy approaches aren't working and there is a commitment to change. My experience in 20 years is the bureaucracy, and I don't mean that in an offensive way, but we are either too conservative or too hamstrung to make the kind of change that, even if we see it, we don't often have the opportunity. So for us, the ministerial task force, 7 cabinet ministers sitting around a table helping us develop OCA, was a really strong signal of political commitment. 2, 3 truths you must accept if you're going to do this work this way. The policies that are fixated on deficits and gaps haven't worked, will never work. 2, government policies and practices of the past have caused trauma and distrust, and that is the context within which you're working. And the culture, connection and healing are at the heart of improving Aboriginal people's wellbeing, and that's why relationships are critical. People need to trust that they're being heard and that we are responding in a positive way, because we can actually do more harm, create more trauma, even with the best intentions. So you have to be ready to grapple with what deep engagement with Aboriginal communities means and its consequences for the way we develop policy. It does raise expectations. And community trust will be gained or lost as a consequence of what you do and how you behave. And my experience has been that while communities do generously embrace opportunities to be involved, they will put you on notice, and they are getting tired of the broken promises. Strangely as it seems, you need to be prepared to be held to account for the agreements that you make, the services that you provide. You must be willing to stay the course, test, evaluate, keep going together. You will need to expose yourself to community scrutiny. You need to take criticism, you need to accept when what you're doing isn't working, and you need to keep turning up. You do need to be vigilant. You need to check in regularly that you haven't lost sight of your policy intent. As I said earlier, it's easy to fall back into old ways of doing things because they save time, that's where we're comfortable, but it will mean that your credibility is hanging in the balance. For us, for instance, local decision making, we can't lose sight of the fact that it was developed as a local accountability mechanism. The minute we see it as a local community engagement forum, it's over. So we have to always remember what our policy intent was. We do need to take a hard look at our structures. These do get in the way, I've talked about that. Certainly for Aboriginal Affairs, our structure, our roles, our operating model, all of that changed with OCA because we had to, that all had to line up with a new way of doing business. And that there was resistance to that, within and without. And I think you do need, well, I don't think, I know, you do need to bring a greater diversity of Aboriginal perspectives to the table when you're having these conversations. Going with your existing MOUs, talking only to your peak bodies, it's not going to be sufficient. You're not going to get the breadth, the diversity of interest, of views, of priority, of aspiration in those communities that you're working with. Seven, and this is important, don't ever lose sight of the time and resources it takes to work in this way. It is not quick, it is not easy, it is not cheap. You will go around. It'll feel like you're going around and around. It'll feel like, God, I've got to stop that. It will feel like you're having to revisit things all the time, but that's how you create mutual understanding, and that's how you create genuine buy-in. And my experience has been that Aboriginal communities will always prefer us to take more time to get it right than to rush something that doesn't work for them ultimately and doesn't meet their expectations. And number 8, you need to create the right environment for this. So you do have to invest in the capacity of Aboriginal leaders to come to the table. You do have to hold people to account for their actions. Never accept racism, even if it's unconscious bias. You do need to create a culture of innovation and safe failure, and you do need both. You don't have one without the other. And you need to value the insights and the capabilities of Aboriginal public servants. People need to be valued as members of their own communities and as Aboriginal people, and they have insights that are important in working in this way. So I'll finish there. Suffice to say, from my perspective, we are entering into a new era in the way policy is being developed in New South Wales. We're saying yes, we're showing up, we're diving deep, we're doing things differently, and communities are saying to us they feel better connected, they feel more empowered, they feel more hopeful, they feel more in control, and they're all positives. So I guess that's my challenge to you. Dive in, get uncomfortable, be innovative. It's been rewarding from my perspective, and I know that Aboriginal communities want to be part of the solutions to the issues that they face. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I had some years ago now with the Secretary's Board when we first took them local decision making as a concept, and their response to me was, well, the current approach hasn't worked. We've really got nothing to lose, so why wouldn't we give this a crack? And so I would leave you with that. Give it a crack. Thank you.
Don't fall over there.
Kind of a shock. I'm going to get out of the way.
Sorry. It's our office set up. Look, thank you so much for coming along to do that. That was really good. Look, I've taken away a few things from that, and I'm sure my fellow colleagues absolutely would have taken away a few things. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? We'll take a few questions. We'll just wait for the travelling microphone to get travelled to you.
Sure you've got a question?
Thank you.
My question was, I was actually trying to scroll some notes down quite quickly. My phone wasn't making text messages. And I took a couple of photos of your presentation. Is there a handout that we might be able to circulate amongst the group just with some of the points that you've made? So when we do engage with Aboriginal people, we can ensure that we're doing it the right way, or in an appropriate way.
Is there a handout? I'm not sure, actually. I will check on that and see what we've got. There are a bunch of resources on our website, Aboriginal Affairs website. You might even find some video of similar versions of that presentation. So by all means, check that out.
And this seminar, as well as the first one, were filmed.
Oh.
So they are going to both be on YouTube. The first one's already on there, and so the presentation will be on there as well. So please have a look at that.
Fantastic, thank you.
Any other questions?
So I said it wasn't rocket science.
Hey. Oh, look, I've got a question for you.
Good.
Just you talk about like 8 great principles there, with a lot of work that staff would have to go on and work in a new way to do. So can you just mention a few of the skills that you think that like staff would have to like personally grow to be able to go and do this work?
Yeah. Interestingly, the most important skill or approach is stop. What we find often is people want to jump in, and even kind of get sometimes conflicting messages even from community depending on how things are travelling. So we were doing some work in a part of the state I won't mention there, and there was some, this will sound unusual, there was some infighting within the community, and there was this kind of sense on one hand that we're doing this work and it's community in control. On the other hand, there was almost this view, well, not almost, there was this kind of approach that was, you're responsible, Aboriginal Affairs, for that program. It's not working because there are people in the community who, we don't get on with. You need to stop it. You need to close it down. We even had an ombudsman tell us that, we needed to intervene in that, and our response had to be, actually, no. The whole rationale for the way we're working is about building local governance, local self-determination. So yes, we need to be providing advice to people about how to manage conflict, but actually it's not our job to jump in, and I think we do that too often with Aboriginal communities. We've had this kind of history of, even at community invitation, to jump in, and so for us, the biggest learning has been to stop and not jump in. So whether it's talking about, as I said, when communities came to us and said, well, tell us what our boundaries need to be, we could easily say, well, this boundary would make sense to us because it lines up with the health boundary or it lines up with the local government boundary, whatever it is, but it's actually, no, we need to support you to make these decisions for yourself. So the first skill, if you'd call it a skill, was actually to stop and check ourselves and say, is this way of working, if we jump in and try to fix this, is it actually productive to what we're trying to achieve in the long run. The other one, I guess, for me has been, and again I talked a little bit about this, is that skill around negotiation and collaboration. And what we saw, I'll be quite honest with you, I have seen situations where government negotiators have gone to the table with Aboriginal communities and thrown stones at one another across the table. We wouldn't go into a conversation with the federal government or another jurisdiction and behave that way, but for some reason we think it's okay to kind of air our dirty laundry in a community negotiation. So for me that says a lot about how serious we take that negotiation and the respect we're showing not only our colleagues but also the Aboriginal community that we're negotiating with. So it's taught us a little bit, I think, about the capability on the ground, and that's not just something that's going to be applicable in the situation of negotiating accords between the government and Aboriginal communities. But if this is the way public servants are behaving in regional New South Wales in this context, then maybe they're behaving that way in other contexts as well. And it's raised some interesting issues for us, I think, around training and culture.
Fantastic, thank you for that. Well, 1:30 exactly. Look at that timekeeping. Look,
Is that you or me?
that was me.
Shared.
That was me.
We're sharing the power.
Yeah, co-designing the seminar. I like it.
Yeah, perfect.
Hey, thanks again for coming along.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I'll see you another day, hey?
Absolutely.
Excellent.